Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today, at the start of this video, I want to address the fact that I'm not the most widely read person in the world, not even by a good bit. And certainly I can't even really say that I'm the widest read specifically within the fantasy genre or epic fantasy, more specifically for the purposes of today's video and this channel kind of broadly. Epic fantasy is my general preference within the genre. Essentially, I've only read a handful of epic fantasy series up to this point, and even if you were to include some other stuff that is in the science fantasy side of things that feels very fantasy in construction but maybe a little bit more sci-fi in setting or something like that, I've not read that much of the genre is the point I'm making. Out of only around 200 books read and reviewed, I would say that only a few dozen of those are epic fantasy, believe it or not, or at least of the traditional type, or the more recognizable type, we should say. But of all those books or series, few of them have been as memorable as the subject of today's video, Legacy of Ash by Matthew Ward. Not to bury the lead, of course, although I guess I have been for the last couple minutes at this point, I really liked this book, and I want to talk about why. We will start off just like normal with the good, because there are a lot of really great things to say about this, in my opinion. The main one of those, or maybe not the main one of those actually, but the first one of those that I want to shout out is the diverse set of characters and their interactions related to each other. There are multiple nationalities of people, including one of those nationalities of people having two basically distinct cultural subsets. If you understand that no small amount of this book is based around a sort of Civil War type of energy going on, that might make sense. There is a bit of that Civil War dynamic being worked through, sometimes multiple of those alongside the other major conflicts of the book. And there's amongst those are like an invasion, pushback of war being dealt with. There's just a lot going on with regards to the different backgrounds of different characters, and thus the interactions that these people can have, and the political dynamics born from those characters and their interactions are absolutely incredible. Editing KC here to mention that there's one particular group of people that I somehow forgot to mention in the review, but one thing that I think is really great about it is actually the gods. The gods of this world actually do play a role within the story, and even though that role is relatively limited in this first book, there's very strong evidence that they're going to serve a much heavier role in the books to come within the series, and I can also attest to that, having now at the point of this insertion here, having read over 100 pages of the second book. That's another really great piece of the character dynamics. There's no efficient way to really explain just what there is on offer in this book politically without just, spoiling every different political dynamic. But I think that if you enjoy political fantasy, or if you're not as much for the action within fantasy, if you care a little bit more about the intimate dynamics of characters rather than the broader sweeping war or something like that, I would say definitely read this, because while there is a lot of the broader implications of war and the conflict, politically speaking, of course, the actual action is definitely not the forefront piece of this. The politics is really at the heart of the book, and it is incredible. Relatedly, since I started off this section talking about characters, the character motivations are so dynamic and realistic that I just found them incredibly memorable the entire time while I was reading. Each of the main characters is so fully themselves, with their own beliefs, their own, like I said, motivations, their own dynamics with one another, and even with side characters as well. It's not just the main characters. Even most of the side characters are more naturally delivered within this book, with their beliefs, their motivations, everything, so as to feel like real people. I've given this type of compliment to, a solid handful of books over the last few years, but this one is the one where I feel like even side characters feel like main characters, because every character is the main character of their own story, right? So while I would say there's technically a main character per se, like a number one main character, and the author would also say that that character is what most of the story kind of revolved around within the construction of it. But even so, there are several main characters within the book, and like I said, each of those characters is so fully fleshed out that even some side characters feel like main characters. Everybody is the main character of their own story, and as a result, you get very nuanced takes within their motivations, within their political backgrounds, within the places that they come from, and their interactions with other characters, and especially where those other characters come from. And a lot of the details of that changes throughout the book in ways that, again, to use the word for the 50th time, feel very dynamic. And as I also said before, very realistic. You know, there's no chosen one trope here. There's no, I wouldn't say that this book utilizes tropes with regards to character construction very much. Again, each of those characters is so fully fleshed out that it doesn't feel like you're necessarily reading any character who has intrinsically been done before. Each of them moves quite frequently. If you're going to talk about you know, round versus flat characters, basically every character in this book is very round. That's not to say that flat characters are bad, of course, but it is really interesting when nearly every single character is as round as they are in this one. Editing KC back again just to also praise the fact that related to characters and particularly the political dynamics associated with them, Legacy of Ash also does a really great job of handling the particular question of history. You know, obviously history is written by the victors, that whole type of thing where history can be unreliable or straight up even wrong sometimes depending on who's telling it. Matthew Ward also plays a pretty solid game with this particular aspect with the series, and you know, certain stories or characters whose past and whatnot might not even exist or might exist in different ways than they actually happened, just in accordance with the way that the primary culture within the book handles the idea of history. That's what I'll say with regards to the characters and all that kind of thing. Another aspect of the book that I enjoyed is that while there is a little bit of battle and action and stuff within the book, of course, it is epic fantasy, and it is a long epic fantasy at that. The intentionality behind all of the battle scenes doesn't glorify the action or the violence in the way that I think that some other books might, right? As I suggested, Legacy of Ash is a very political book, and violence isn't really central to what it's doing in any regard, right? If there are battle scenes that make your eyes glaze over in any other fantasy book, worry not with regards to Legacy of Ash, because here it's more of a background element, you know, or rather there's always a distinct background element driving the action, driving that battle, and that background being usually character related or politically motivated, where the action itself is not necessarily the point. If you compare Matthew Ward to an author like John Gwynne, for example, I think that John Gwynne is a very action-forward fantasy writer, at least within The Faithful and The Fallen, and Matthew Ward tends to hold a little bit back from that, in my opinion, right? So you can't even really say that the violence that does exist within Legacy of Ash is super R-rated compared to, say, something like John Gwynne, because John Gwynne's violence is very visceral, it's very forward, and it is a key part of that story. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a key piece of this in that same way. Like I said, there is still a little bit of action here at a couple of different points, but the interpersonal and political conflict is just as much the deal. It is just as important, if not frequently more important, than the actual action combat. So I know plenty of people who don't really enjoy reading action or battle scenes, so if you're one of those people, this book might just do it for you because there's not as much of that, and the scenes that do occur are very character forward rather than battle sequence forward, if that makes any sense. But my next couple of praises for Legacy of Ash are going to be with regard to the structure a little bit more, rather than some of the more particular details of it. Legacy of Ash is really memorable to me as a climax and resolution forward reader because it has each of these things in really deep effect, and climaxes in particular, because there's not just one, there's two of them, and each of them serve to each of those aforementioned points, right? One of the climaxes is basically the expanded action and battle climactic sequence, although it is handled a little bit differently because, the action is defined mostly by the political motivations. And then the other climax is that of the actual political side of things, set mainly in a separate location. This book takes place primarily in two locations, and one of those is where the main battle climax occurs, and the other one is where the main political climax occurs. And another thing that is really interesting about the way that these are constructed and included in the book is that the political climax actually follows the battle climax. So you don't actually have some of that battle scene and then you just resolve everything right at the very end of the book. The battle sequence that actually occurs here is occurs about halfway through the book, and then you have the political climax after that. So like I said, the structure is just slightly different in that way, but still just as epic, and having two major things going on that get those big momentous sequences is really awesome. And the thing that makes it even more awesome for me, like I said, not just being a climax person, but being a resolution type of person as well. I just love endings, especially when they close off well. This book closes off well by following a dedicated resolution that fully satisfies upon both of those aforementioned climaxes, and the resolution also being quite lengthy. I would say that I'm not entirely sure how much space, but I want to say somewhere around 150 of the 750 pages here are closing off those climaxes and, having a little bit of resolution there. After both of the primary climaxes have ensued, both of the ones that I just described a couple of minutes ago, there then comes the extended sequence to close them up. Like I said, it's pretty lengthy. This resolution also is interesting because it is almost a secondary climax for each of those plot lines, and then the resolution kind of combined into one thing. So it's not like you have the climax here and the climax here, and then you spend 150 pages just tying up all the loose ends. It's more so you have each of those climaxes, and there's still major things that need to be taken care of, right? It's not just a matter of, oh, there's a couple loose ends to tie up. It's like, no, there's major loose ends actually following each of those, and that has to be tied up and taken care of. And that means that there's still, a lot of drive to the narrative, even within this technically more resolution phase. The resolution phase is very dynamic as a result, and like I said, also quite lengthy. So there's just a lot of things really going on with the structure of Legacy of Ash that I really love. It actually covers everything really well and makes sure that there still aren't any loose ends. It covers everything. It spends a lot of time making sure that it's not leaving anything on the table, is basically what it comes down to. And more than that, despite the length of the book, despite it having so much going on, so much happening throughout the course of the narrative, this book doesn't waste any time at all. This will be like my final major point for praise of Legacy of Ash, is that it's a 250,000 long word book, 250,000 word long book. That's the better way to structure those words. Sorry about that. But this does enough with it that it doesn't feel like it's that short, it does so much that it seems like it should have been longer, but it's not, right? So even though it is 750 pages, the way that Orbit likes to format their books is they're a little bit more generous with regards to how many words there are on each page. And by more generous, I mean there's less words per page than some other fantasy. Take, for instance, a Wheel of Time book. For example, Wheel of Time is going to make a great counterpart to Legacy of Ash with regards to length versus the efficiency of utilizing those words. This book is not short. Like I said, it's 250,000 words long, somewhere thereabouts, maybe give or take a couple dozen thousand words in there, but it does like twice as much with that word count than you would get from a comparably length Wheel of Time book. So if you've read Wheel of Time and you know how sluggish the average book is in there in terms of its pacing, even if you enjoy it, we're just talking about how fast it actually goes about doing what it's doing, even when it's doing it well. it doesn't do anywhere near as much as what this book is doing. So, like I said, this book is not short, but it's surprising that it's not longer than it is because of how much it's got going on. I guess that's the point that I was trying to make a moment ago. You know, certainly anybody else trying to do this much with a book would end up with a book that was much longer or much less focused, because despite this having so much going on, it never loses the focus or anything like that either. Furthermore, Legacy of Ash also manages to do all that it does, and this is, you know, continuing on that resolution point, is that it leaves everything off with a clear view of what the next arc of the story is going to be, but does so while closing off everything that this book is. It has a lot on its plate, but it manages to tackle all of those things. It says, these are the things that this book is going to do. We're doing all those things, and by the end of the book, you have a pretty good idea. It's just like, okay, so the arc of the next book is probably going to deal with this particular conflict or this particular character dynamic here. And yeah, the book makes very clear that that's what it's doing, but what it does leave open for the next book isn't a loose end. Like, it's hard to explain that something can be like not a loose end to pick up in the next book. It's more like it's closed off as far as it is necessary for this book. The arc that some of those loose ends make up within this book are closed off as far as this book needs them to be, and just leaves them off in a way that's just like, we're going to come back to you later. So, you know, you could still call that a loose end, but in my mind, it's a little bit different than a loose end, because a loose end feels like it's something that's left unresolved more or less unintentionally sometimes. This book does not leave anything unintentionally left open. So, you know, everything that Legacy of Ash sets out to do, it gets done by the end, but you don't finish the book wondering what could be coming next, because it still makes very clear what the focus of the next book is basically going to be. So, you know, that's my very lengthy praise for Legacy of Ash. But with all of that, let's jump over into the bad of the book, because I do think that there are a couple points to make clear for potential readers of the book that, you know, maybe not everybody is going to love this book and think it's basically perfect the way that I do, because I really, really love this book. I had essentially no issues with it. But there are a couple things to point out nonetheless. The first one of those being that there are occasional moments, especially in like the last third of the book, basically within like the more or less resolutionary phase, where things could be pointed out as being potentially convenient. Furthermore, I think that there's one particular character dynamic, a pair of characters, where their evolution together might seem a little bit rushed or potentially unbelievable as a result, and I wouldn't necessarily fault anybody for calling that out or for thinking that that's the case, because it is very borderline there. Those conveniences are so minor, especially compared to what this book does successfully so well the rest of the time, and does successfully even with the things that are relatively convenient, that it never bothered me. So like, it might bother some other people a little bit more than it did me, but I don't think it's going to ruin the book for anybody, basically, you know? Editing KC just one more time to mention the two very minor things that did actually affect my experience a tiny bit. One of them indirectly, and one of them more is just kind of a background question that wasn't really answered. The indirect point that I'll make is that the dramatis personae and the map at the very beginning of the book aren't as helpful as I feel like they ought to be. There are too many characters that don't have an entry at the very beginning, like in the dramatis, that makes it hard to actually remember some of the characters because of that. And then also the map has plenty of locations that are mentioned in the book that just straight up aren't there. And the map doesn't utilize anything like roads or whatnot in the art of it. So those two things at the beginning of the book just aren't as helpful as I feel like they should be for me personally. The map in the second book has more stuff on it, so that's good. And the beginning also mentions a little bit more characters in it, but having read, again, those first 100 pages or so, it still falls into the same problem of just having some characters that aren't mentioned there for some reason, so it's easy to forget some of the side characters because they're just not they're not in there for whatever reason. So that's like a very minor point that's probably not going to affect very many people's experiences. It didn't affect mine very much. It's just a minor thing. If you're going to include it, it should be more useful than it is, at least in this series, in my opinion. And then the other point that I do want to bring up very briefly here is that there's two councils within the main city location of the series. One of them is the Grand Council and one of them is the Privy Council. And for some reason, the Grand Council just like does not have any say or any effect on anything within the book. Basically, it's appearing like they'll have a little bit more say in the second book, but like the Privy Council is what basically runs everything. So I'm still, as of yet, trying to figure out why there's a distinction between these two, why there's a Grand Council in the first place. But again, that's just a very minor point that's like maybe it'll be answered, but I'm not sure. So on with the rest of the video. The other quote-unquote problem with the book is not a problem in that it's a bug. It is very much a feature, but the book is very focused on the slow burn political buildup. I describe this book as being a very political book. Like, if you were to try to define what this book is, I would say it's political fantasy more than it is anything else, right? That is definitely the main thing it's got going on. As a result, the first half of it is a lot of buildup. It is a lot of slow burn. It is a lot of, stuff that is needing to be taken care of and built up at the start. But like, if you're reading epic fantasy, you're probably used to this kind of thing anyway. And I would say that this book almost makes up for the amount of time that it takes to actually get where it's going, because it doesn't actually take as long as you might think to get where it's going. I kind of mentioned earlier that, the resolution is quite lengthy at the end of the book, but also that the main battle climax basically happens halfway through the book. That is basically true. So while it takes half of the book to continue to mount tension leading up to that point occurs sooner than the last 50 pages of the book. This isn't like a Robert Jordan Wheel of Time book where it takes literally until like 50 pages before the end before he actually gets into climax gear. That's why a lot of Robert Jordan climaxes just aren't very good. It's because they're rushed. They don't have the time to do what they need to do. This book, half of it is the collective climax and payoff between all of its different focuses. So there is a lot of buildup, but it pays off on all of that in very big ways, in my opinion. So, and there's also the fact that while the resolution being lengthy is really good for me, there might be some people who might think that the last third is a little bit overwrought. Just because it is as long as it is, but it is still tackling so much that I feel like it's deserved. I don't think this book wastes any time, but there might be some people that are a little bit more sensitive to that kind of thing. But that's going to take us into the ugly for Legacy of Ash, and for a change, I'm going to make this about like the anti-ugly, basically. So if this is more of like this might be something you might want to avoid with the book, it's more so if there is something that you do tend to avoid in other books, and especially in, relatively speaking, darker fantasy books that make it hard to read dark fantasy, this book might attract you in ways that other books can't. And that is because if you happen to find particularly sexual content or egregious language to be bothersome to you, you can absolutely read Legacy of Ash without any worries, basically whatsoever. There's not a lick of sexual content in this book, and the language here is extremely limited. Yet there is still that very grounded, more or less dark fantasy tone still going on. There's a lot about this book that is still very serious. It's not lighthearted or noble bright fantasy or anything like that. If anything, and I don't know really any technicalities when it comes to grimdark versus noble dark or anything like that, I would argue personally, again without much experience within the technicalities of some of these labels, I think Legacy of Ash is pretty noble dark. It's got certain grim aspects to it. It does have certain dark fantasy tendencies to it, but again, it is very noble. It has a very hope-filled type of thing going on. It isn't getting dingy or dirty. It's utilizing that to counter the motivations of the good guys, so to speak. But there are also very bad characters as well. And again, there's not any of that really dingy, gross, dirty sexual content going on, and there's also very little language, and what little language does occur here is mild obscenities at worst, basically. So if you are somebody who's sensitive to either of those types of things within fantasy books, you want to read a dark fantasy book that doesn't have those kinds of things, read this because it does have some of that more serious stuff, but without utilizing the very modern, grimdark type of approach of just being gritty and grody and gross, you know? So this is a recommendation on that front. And speaking of recommendations, this is that section now. I think that if you are into epic fantasy in any way, shape, or form, I think you owe it to yourself to give this a try. If you're more into action-forward fantasy than you are political fantasy, this maybe won't be 100% your jam, but generally speaking, I think that if you're into epic fantasy at all, you should definitely read this. And if you are into political fantasy, this is a slam dunk. It's going to be great for you basically no matter what, I think, and really the recommendation is as simple as that. I think that you should read this. Really, I don't see much of a reason that any fantasy fan would actively dislike this book, basically. You know, I hate using the term underrated because most people use it wrong. I wouldn't argue that Legacy of Ash is underrated from what I've seen, but I definitely think it's overlooked. I haven't seen very many people actually read this book or this series, and thus they don't really talk about it. I want more people to read this. Like, if there's going to be, you know, a new trend on Fantasy BookTube of a series to give a read in the near future, I hope that this series ends up getting up there eventually. And I know this is only book one of a trilogy. The next two books could be terrible, but even if the next two books weren't very good, this book was good enough to definitely make it worth the recommendation. And you know, based off what I said earlier, it closes off everything that this book actually needs to do. It doesn't leave anything in a way that's like, oh man, I have to read the next book. Like, there's no cliffhanger aspects to it. You know what the next book is going to do, but for a more or less closed arc in and of itself, please read this. So anyway, that's going to be the end of this video. If I have not convinced you to read this book, I don't know what to tell you, really. I hope that I have convinced you to read it, but at the same time, I also hope that I haven't oversold it. Like, I don't want people to read this expecting it to be the best book that they've ever read, because I wouldn't necessarily argue that myself, but I would say that it is maybe the best fantasy book that I've read in the last 2 years, and maybe even longer than that, depending on whether or not you're actually willing to call The Failures by Benjamin Lyer epic fantasy, because, like, it is, but it's so different from any other epic fantasy that, like, it's hard to really think of it the same way. Kind of same thing with Dark Tower. Like, yeah, that's a fantasy series, but like, it's not epic fantasy the way that you would typically think of it. So Legacy of Ash is one of my favorite fantasy books I've read in years, for sure, and I really hope that more people give it a shot. So that's where I'll leave this here. If you do give the book a shot, definitely let me know how you like it. Around the time that this video comes out, I am actually starting book 2. I say that actually knowing that I just read the prologue for book 2 this morning, so you know, I have technically started the book already, but that's like 15 pages that I read this morning, and there's 750 pages to go, basically. So I'm going to be doing that over the next couple weeks, and I hope to review that book next month, assuming that nothing goes wrong in the process of video production or anything else for that matter. But with all that being said, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.